Surviving the Survivor.
What's up, STS Nation, and welcome back. It has been 37 days, hard to believe. Still no suspect named by police, no persons of interest. Also, no weapon has been found. And while we don't have the answers to any of that, we do have two amazing guests to try to fill us in on some of the voids we are facing well over a month into this quadruple murder mystery. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. Alfred S. Titus. He is a retired veteran of the New York City Police Department. He served over 23 years with the NYPD and retired after serving 13 plus years with the distinguished Homicide Squad and as an active member of NYPD's prestigious and world-renowned hostage negotiation team. He has a little bit of experience with over 500 homicides investigated, and he's a pretty good student too. He's got a master's and a PhD that were earned, and he's a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And if you're from Jersey like me and grew up in the city, you know it's one of the finest criminal justice institutions in all the land. And then we have the double pleasure of Professor Stephen Smith. He is a professor emeritus where this all happened at the University of Idaho in Moscow. He is the professor emeritus of the School of Journalism and Mass Media, bringing close to 40 years of experience in professional journalism as an editor of papers in Salem, Oregon, Colorado Springs, Colorado. And as I mentioned, he now teaches media and society and media and ethics, and we need some of that in our day and age. And quick housekeeping notes. You can listen to Surviving the Survivor anywhere podcasts are found. If you would like to help support us, which we need greatly, both emotionally and monetarily, you can find us at Patreon at Surviving the Survivor. You get behind-the-scenes footage, ad-free content, and this woman here who appears on the show, that is Cutout Carm. The real one is a Holocaust survivor, a licensed therapist, and on January 5th at 8 p.m., she is taking your questions for all people who are on Patreon. As I like to do each time, these become whodunits, as Professor Titus knows, and so I like to remember the names of the victims, so let us never forget those young lives lost way too soon. Madison Mogan, 21, Kaylee Gonzalez, 21, Zana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin, also 20 years old. Now, there is some breaking news and developments in this case, so let's go to the latest here, and that is coming out of Moscow, Idaho, where Chief James Fry says that 10,000 tips have come in so far, but emphasizes they still need help looking for that white Hyundai Elantra that Ebola was out for. I believe now it was 2 weeks ago, a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra. So to you, Professor Titus, 10,000 tips on a case like this, a lot, or is it what you would expect?
That is a lot of tips. 10,000 tips is a lot to sort through. It's a lot to try to distinguish as what's credible, what's not credible, what's just people just trying to get involved and really have no real input, or those that are really giving them quality information. It just makes the job of the investigators that much more difficult.
If I might add there, that's only 10,000 tips on the Elantra. I saw a number from the NPD just yesterday. Total tips in this case from the beginning, about 22,000.
Wow.
Oh, wow. So, Steve, I'm glad the teacher comes in to save the day. I'm glad you pointed that out. I thought that was 10,000 total tips. Yeah. That's a big distinction. So just 10,000 on this alone. Separately on this show, we cover a homicide case that's being tried now in the court system. And the person who's on trial, Charlie Adelson, in discovery in that case, there are 57,000 documents and 6,000 video surveillance tapes that are going into discovery. So investigators have their hands full. But Dr. Titus, to you as well, 60 FBI agents have been assigned to the case. We're just finding that out. Last time they released this information, which was about a week and a half ago, there were 46 FBI agents. You do the math, they've added 14 FBI agents. Does that come as a surprise, or do they need that extra help in trying to figure out exactly what is happening?
It really seems like they need the help. One thing that I know just through experience with investigations and working with the FBI, as more of the case is uncovered, sometimes certain specialties are needed. There are agents that have particular specialties, maybe DNA, maybe surveillance, maybe and since with the addition of the vehicle, that alone could have um, called for more investigators coming in. And the thing with the 10,000 calls, the 10,000 tips, if you think about it, probably there are probably tips coming in from every white Elantra that is driving around in the country. So I can just imagine it's only going to get higher. That number is going to continue to increase.
And Dr. Titus, how do you weed those out? Because I mean, it's such a big number, and you probably, in your mind, I mean, 99% are going to not really lead anywhere. But how do you make sure you're not missing the one that's important?
Yeah, that is the difficult part. As an investigator, you have to take each tip as credible until you find out otherwise. So the full gamut of the investigation process, whatever that is for the particular tip, has to be followed through from beginning to end until it's found not to be credible. And that's a lot of work, and that alone could be the reason why they increase the manpower.
Professor Smith, do you happen to know off the top of your head? I know it's been quite a while since there has been an actual press conference. I know the PIO, who's not even really with the Moscow Police Department, has been speaking individually to the media. But any idea how long it's been since there's been an actual press conference? And does it bother you? Are you concerned that it's been as long as it has been?
Well, there was actually a press briefing this afternoon from Chief Fry. It was very short. And no real additional information provided, more of the we have our work cut out for us sort of thing. If you'll recall some of my earlier comments, frankly, I'm glad they've shut up. One of the problems with this case, especially early on, were too many voices, too much conflicting information that was causing enormous difficulty in the community, causing pain and suffering to the families. Fewer press conferences as a journalist doesn't bother me if in return what we get is a quality investigation. My journalists, my reporters would have been perfectly capable of doing their job without staged press briefings.
And I'm glad you're at least a heck of a lot closer than I am here on the East Coast. But it was my understanding that was they were just releasing information, but it was an actual in-person press briefing with Chief Fry. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I have no idea how many reporters were there. The clips I saw showed at least two asking questions, but it was in terms of providing any new information, it was valueless, and you would expect that. They still have no suspect, or at least nothing that they're talking about publicly. They still have no leads except what they say publicly. They're still looking for the Elantra. They've exhausted, apparently, and that was one of the things the chief said, they've exhausted the local Elantra registrations. So if there were an easy path to find this Elantra and its owner, that's gone. So now, as Professor Titus has said, it gets down to real shoe leather. And if I can say one more thing about the tips, I have no ability to understand exactly where these tips are coming from, but this has become such an international story. And if you think of tips including the garbage that is posted to social media, the number of suspects whose names are thrown out in social media all the time, my guess is that a good number of those tips are not from within the local community and probably are from far-flung places where people have absolutely no clue, including some people who consider themselves experts, if you'll pardon my saying.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Titus, I heard early on, and in the New York Post or the Daily News, someone interviewed a retired NYPD homicide detective who said, look, a quadruple homicide would be difficult for us. So two-part question for you. Did you ever handle a quadruple homicide? And what about the high-profile nature of this? How do you negotiate? That's your specialty. It was not intended to be a pun, but how do you negotiate the media in a situation like this?
Yeah. In my years in homicide, I've investigated a triple, never a quadruple. And the amount of pressure, not only from the community, the victims community, for us, it would be One Police Plaza, which is our headquarters. We get pressure from them. We want answers. And then we have the press to deal with as well. The press can be very aggressive. A lot of times we feel that when they don't get the answers that they want, they may go to other sources outside of official sources, and that's an issue. So then things just start getting crazy and hectic, and information is coming from all different angles. It can be very difficult, but I can tell you one thing for sure. Homicides do not always get solved in 30 days. They do not always get solved in 60 days. Sometimes they take years. And this is a quadruple, and it's very possible that it could take that long. It could take months. We might not know who the killer is until the spring, or maybe even longer than that. There are just so many different intermingling parts involved with an investigation that makes it so difficult to even make assumptions, you know?
So this length of time so far, 37 days, I think, when this will come out, is not really surprising to you, especially considering it was a quadruple homicide here.
Exactly. This is not even considered long for the standard of a homicide investigation. This is not even a long amount. This is not even a long period of time.
If my information is correct, and Steve, you'll correct me if it's not, but I think today when the Moscow police chief, James Fry, was also basically forced to concede the possibility of a larger danger with this targeting, not targeting talk at the beginning, basically said that we cannot say that there is no threat to the community. Did you hear that today? What was your take? I'm curious.
I didn't hear that today, but he has said that now before. After the first 3 or 4 days, they finally conceded that they cannot rule out a threat to the community. So that's not particularly new information within the community. Every time it's said, it's a thunderclap, and it's very difficult to overstate the fear and the suspicion and the concern within the Moscow-Pullman community. People in the community believe there's a threat, and that's hard enough. And if I could say for Professor Titus, it's complicating the investigation. This happened at a university community just before Thanksgiving break. And as we've discussed here before, within days, the community emptied of students. Mm-hmm. Now they've gone home for the holidays, along with faculty and staff. So you've got thousands and thousands of people who were in the community on November 13th, who are now spread across the region or further, potential tips and witnesses that are much harder now to track down.
Yeah.
Another number that I have heard bandied about, and I don't think there's any way to officially corroborate this unless Chief Fry explicitly said this today, but there have been roughly 150 interviews conducted. To me, and I know nothing about anything, I'm a news guy that brings in the experts, 150 seems like a lot, but not necessarily in a case like this, Professor Titus. Is that a lot of interviews?
It is a lot for a single homicide. For a quadruple, when you're when you're thinking about the families of each individual victim, the friends and the associates of each individual victim, the fact that they were out throughout that evening, and so all of those interviews have to be done. There is a lot of ground to cover. So 150 is definitely not out of the norm.
Professor Titus, everyone's talking about everything. Is there one thing that everyone is missing at this point that you would point to as a seasoned investigator that might be obvious or not obvious?
Well, it's really hard to say because we don't have all the information, and that makes it difficult to really assess the situation. But I believe that they have ideas, they have directions, and they're just being smart and not letting the public know, which is exactly what they're supposed to be doing. The fact that the FBI is still involved and they're bringing in more people, progress is being made. We're just not aware of it. I, it's so hard because I've heard so many different things. I'm not even sure what's actually true anymore, considering everything that I've heard. But I would think, if it is one person and multiple stabbings, there should be DNA. Anytime you enter a crime scene, you leave DNA for the most part. And when you're that active in a crime scene, that means your arms are flailing, you're you're moving back and forth, you're going from room to room, you're touching things. I mean, unless you're totally prepared where you're all gloved up and wearing a Tyvek suit, you're gonna leave DNA. So there has to be evidence at that crime scene. It's just putting the puzzle together right now.
Something else that came out, I guess some journalists, Steve, went around and spoke to sporting goods and hardware stores in the area, um, and confirmed that police detectives had visited these sporting goods stores to see if they had sold K-bar style military knives. So back to you, Professor Titus. That's is that SOP, standard operating procedure, to go out to these types of stores to see what was purchased? And after that, Steve, if you want to talk about the media's role so far, if they're overstepping their bounds. But to you first, Professor Titus.
Absolutely, that is standard procedure. We've had cases where we've gotten a footprint or some type of clothing or a piece of a blanket, and we've gone throughout the entire country trying to figure out who makes it, how many have been sold, where it was sold, when it was sold, credit card receipts. So this is common practice. We can hope that that weapon was sold recently, but it's also very possible that he's had that he or she or they have had these weapons for a long period of time. But it is a part of the investigation that has to be covered. Absolutely.
Steve, how's the media coverage been thus far?
Well, I've talked about this before, and locally, I don't have too much concern. My biggest concern is that after so much time, I wish a couple of the bigger organizations would be just a tad more aggressive in independent reporting and a little less reliant on official statements, but that's a quibble. They've been relatively responsible. I follow this story regularly, and I find myself looking at reports from news organizations all over the place. And I'm stunned, if you'll pardon my saying to our friend from New York, I'm stunned by the New York press, the Post, and the Daily News, how much reporting is not based on anything other than social media rumor and innuendo. Having nothing else to say, they seem to be relying on social media to provide tips, which ultimately are proved to be completely bogus. And of course, you know how I feel about cable news. It's still shocking and appalling. The only good news there is that after so much time, it's beginning to fade from cable attention span, and that's good news to me.
On to we're going to get back to Professor Titus in a minute, but Steve, I just want to get your take on this too. This came out, I believe, in Chief Lanier's little gaggle today. Says the victims' families have experienced harassment and received death threats. And I'm not going to mention the forum, but there is a forum on a very popular blog site that has 78,000 members. As a guy who worked in the media and teaches media, is it shocking to you that the victims' families are being harassed?
not at all shocking. It's horrible, but it's not the least bit shocking. Happens all the time. It's simply gaining a little bit more attention here because of the scope of this particular crime, the number of family members involved and their spokespeople and community members. The social media frenzy built around this has targeted innocent individuals, labeled them the killer, and held them up to public ridicule and danger. The family's been subjected to harassment and threats. There are forums out there that claim the families did it. This is an insanity that is simply not to be controlled. It exists, and my heart goes out to the families involved in particular. And I have to believe, Professor Titus, that this makes work of the police all the more difficult because of the amount of noise that begins to surround this case and complicates matters considerably. And in that vein, if you notice, the lawyer for one of the families spoke to this just the other day about the terrible circumstances surrounding the families and social media.
I would love to get the professor's take on all that. There is over the weekend, there were some developments as late as Sunday. So I wanted to get Professor and retired Detective Titus's take on this. Fox News is getting a lot of information. So they got surveillance footage from a Facebook group of quote unquote armchair detectives, which I'm curious what Professor Titus thinks of that separately from what I'm about to say. But basically, it's newly obtained video, which police have had, they say, since basically the beginning. And it shows Kaylee and Maddie walking down basically an empty street with another man named Adam. And the victim's father has come out and says he's not a suspect, but essentially Kaylee Gonzalez on the video asks Maddie, "What did you say to Adam?" And a second voice, likely Maddie Mogans, responds, "Like I told Adam everything." I'll let you pick this up, Professor Titus, wherever you want to. What do you make of this latest surveillance video that was gotten by Fox News, but apparently police have had, and how problematic is it that it's out there?
Well, it is very problematic that it is out there. When evidence is retrieved, it's important that it stay close to the cuff because it allows exactly what we're seeing. The armchair detectives, those people who have watched all of the CSIs and all of the Law and Orders, who now consider themselves officially detectives, they come up with their own ideas and they add their own twist to it. When a trained investigator knows that a piece of evidence is just what it is, one piece of a puzzle. It doesn't solve the entire crime in most cases. It's one piece and it has to be taken as such. There's so many other parts of the puzzle that when put together could show a completely different view of what you see if it's just one piece, if that makes sense. And that's the problem with little pieces being disseminated throughout social media, is that, you know, people take it and run with it and it just turns into chaos.
What is it like?
Important to remember here, if you pardon my saying, Joel, Adam is the bartender at the corner club where the girls were partying that night. Police ruled him out as a suspect weeks ago. He's got no involvement with the crime whatsoever. The reports that surfaced in the last few days have targeted him, and he's been subject of harassment from people who say, "Oh, that's got to be suspicious." They were young women talking about a good-looking bartender. The cops know this. Yeah, he's not a suspect. In fact, most of the names that float on social media are not suspects at all. They've been ruled out by the police early on.
Professor Titus, so for full disclosure, I was an investigative reporter at the Fox flagship in New York. And whenever you had to reach out to NYPD, you go through something called DCPI. And it's not an easy task. The NYPD does not mess around. They've got a full-time massive staff to handle just media inquiries. I'm curious though, your take when something leaks in the media, you're working a big case and you see something in the New York Post, What do you all say amongst yourselves? You shake your heads, you get angry, you laugh about it. What is your reaction generally when you're dealing with these high profile cases and stuff does get out there?
Yeah. It's actually a little bit of both. We laugh at it because we know the details of the case, and often what comes out is quite the opposite. So we laugh to that extent. But what bothers us is that and I'm, I almost don't want to say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. We believe, most investigators believe, that the press just fills in the blanks. I'm not sure, and I don't want to put anybody down, but and that's where the anger comes from, because when you start filling in the blanks, you're doing a disservice not only to the victim but to the families and everybody else, because you could be giving them hope, or you could be causing some kind of confusion in an individual's life who should not even be a suspect, and now they're in the public's eye, they're a suspect, like we were mentioned, like we talked about with Adam. um it just confuses everything. So we have a little bit of laughter, and then we usually get angry. And most of the time, at least while I was a detective, I retired in 2016. So social media and these detective sleuths were not as prevalent as they are today. So it may be different today, but our anger was focused towards the media.
And I love having guys like you on, Professor Titus, because the real investigators, the real detectives, you guys are very measured, very thoughtful. The media, which I was a part of and Steve was a part of, we have a tendency to have, like gut reaction to things, a little, don't want to use the word sensationalistic, but we like to jump on stuff. You guys are much more measured. There's always a push and a pull with the media, which I find interesting. One of the issues regarding media is that the father of one of the victims, Kaylee Gonzalez's father, Steve, has been very vocal. He's been criticized by it by both law enforcement experts I've had on here, and others. And others say he's just a grieving father. But this is what he said in a TV interview on Saturday. He says, "We asked and did the obvious due diligence, and we looked into that, and it was pretty clear that this individual, Adam, he's talking about, was not a part of the investigation as far as being a suspect." So, Professor Smith, to you, the media, I guess, has an obligation to go after family to some degree, if you think that. But then how problematic is it for guys like Professor Titus who are investigating cases? Steve?
Well, keep in mind, I taught journalism ethics. And so I have a strong belief in an ethical foundation. So I can't speak for the media in New York. I can only speak for those organizations with which I've been involved. Ethically, we're not supposed to fill in the blanks. It doesn't mean you're not aggressive as a journalist. What it does mean is if you've got facts, you report the facts and you don't speculate, as I've said on this program many times. The kind of speculation and media activity that we've seen, particularly outside the local region, is problematic for everybody involved. It's problematic for the families. It's problematic for that grieving father. But as a journalist who's dedicated to the ethical performance of my duty and responsibility, I would not hesitate to contact family members in a respectful way. I'd knock on their doors. I'd stand outside of funerals. I'd interview friends and neighbors and as many students as I could get my hands on. I don't think that's irresponsible if done in an ethical manner, and the result of which is the reporting of factual information obtained during the course of our investigation. We have different imperatives, and I know Professor Titus will respect this. The imperative of the news organizations is to tell people what you know. Now, that's not to make things up, but to tell people what you know when you know it. The imperative of investigators, like Professor Titus, is to keep information as close to the vest as possible so as not to jeopardize an investigation or a future trial. Those two imperatives can clash, but they don't have to clash in an unethical way.
It's definitely a juxtaposition that you're always dealing with as a member of the media and I guess as a member of law enforcement. Now, Steve Gonzalez was not the only one speaking to the media on the Today Show once again today. An attorney for the family, Shannon Gray, came out and said he's far from satisfied and extremely frustrated with authorities' lack of answers regarding the November 13th stabbings, and went on to say, Professor Titus, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. The attorney went on to say, we want to let them know, meaning investigators, law enforcement, that we are holding them accountable for their decisions. And if they are in over their heads, then acknowledge that and turn the investigation over to someone who is more versed in handling these types of matters. So, Professor Titus, what kind of disservice is it, or what kind of problem is it for law enforcement when you have one of the 4 victims, attorneys for the family, coming out and basically just bashing the work that you're doing?
Yeah. It is a problem. It makes it that much more difficult to do the difficult job that you're doing. The family, unfortunately, that the family has to understand that it is something that takes time. From what I could see, the law enforcement agency in Moscow has done everything that they're supposed to do. They have brought in the FBI. They have brought in extra FBI. They, it's just something that takes time, and the family really should not even be talking to the press openly like that. Like, I mean, I understand what Professor Smith said. Absolutely, the media's job, just like we investigate, they investigate, and that is their job, to speak to the families and things like that. But for the family to be coming out and doing their own press conferences or putting out statements on social media, that's a bit much. They are hindering the investigation, and it's a problem. It makes it that much harder to get the job done, and the community begins to lose trust, and it spirals out of control.
And we're going to get
question.
Go ahead, Steve.
Professor Titus, one of the
Yes.
families has said that they have hired or soon will hire their own private detective. I assume that has to be an issue for investigators.
Absolutely, that definitely is. However, with the amount of press that this case has gotten and the amount of attention, it's no surprise that that is happening, and I'm sure other families will follow suit. Um, Unfortunately, that investigator is more than likely just going to get in the way of police, and I'm sure that with the feds being involved, they will make sure that that investigator, private investigator, is kept at a certain distance. So it'll be handled correctly, I'm sure.
A couple more pieces of
You know what I'm talking about too. That's why you're laughing.
that was in New York. To be taken care of. That's a different kind of be taken care of. So there's one more piece of fairly substantive news that came out, and police released this on Friday, saying that there was a possible, and I underline possible, scream picked up by an officer's body cam as he responded to an unrelated incident around the time of the slayings. We've seen that body cam footage. It was out in a field. Now they're saying there's a possible scream. What do you read into that, Professor Titus, and how critical could that be to the investigation?
Wow, that is like, I don't even know how to explain that, but I'll say this. There are a lot of variables. I use that term in my life. I find myself using it more and more. There are a lot of variables. So that means, like, where did this happen? How far away? There's all kind of variables involved. But if, let's say, it happened in the vicinity of the home, it could be important. If it did not, then it may not be. But at this point, I think everyone is just throwing everything into this fire and just trying to see how big it can get. I would need a lot more information to even be able to determine whether that screen would mean anything, but it could. It's definitely possible.
This report falls into that category of absolutely ridiculous reporting that I talked about. Didn't even make the news here locally.
Yeah.
As many people who are saying it's a scream say it's squealing tires in the background. It's a police officer questioning 3 students who he suspected of underage drinking. The clip lasts for a couple of seconds, and I'm assuming that FBI experts could determine in about 2 seconds if there's a scream in the background. There's just so much of this stuff floating around there. And
well, Steve, you bring up an interesting point. Local news, television news, are they leading with this every night or only when there's information to report?
No, they're not leading with it every night. As I said earlier, the local media is still on the story. They're running daily updates. The television stations on their websites are providing daily updates, even though there's not often much to say. It's certainly not the lead story on TV news, and some nights it's not a story on the broadcast news at all. And there are standing sections within the local newspapers that report on latest developments. What I'm struck with as an ethicist is the level of responsibility the local folks are showing. They are not jumping at all of these red herrings that are being thrown out there by everybody else. They're doing a pretty good job of sorting it all out.
There's actually, we'll get to viewer comments momentarily because I'd like to get Professor Titus's take on some of them. But before we get there, there was a European media outlet who had a reporter on the ground, and I thought it was interesting. They write that Christmas looms, but an eerie, non-festive mood haunts the snowy college town of Moscow, Idaho. And the story goes on to say that locksmith vans have replaced carolers. Some residents are requesting pepper spray or guns as Christmas gifts, and businesses are closing early. Few people want to walk alone, especially at night. Steve, I know you're in Washington State. You no longer live in Moscow, but the people you know there are people that you've spoken to. What is the sense you're getting about life on the ground in Moscow right now?
Well, what you just read is a little overwrite, but it's not inaccurate. Both Moscow and Pullman tend to be ghost towns during Christmas break. They're small communities, and when tens of thousands of students leave for the holidays, things become very quiet. That is more so now. And the interest in buying personal security devices, pressure on the universities to provide security devices. Idaho is an open carry state. So you know there will be more weapons purchased, if not for Christmas presents in time for school to start. It's legal in Idaho to carry a concealed weapon on campus. I had students in my classroom who were armed, and I knew that. I knew they were carrying. So yeah, all of that I think is essentially true. That there is very little festive attitudes in Moscow Pullman this season. Not much at all.
And really no reason to have that in light of what happened back on November 13th. So without further ado, let's take some viewer questions and comments. We have 2 great minds here. Why not use them? The first one comes from Scott Jackson. This one is for Professor Titus, right up your alley. And he writes, is it likely that the police already have a suspect and they're doing surveillance on that person, waiting for an opportunity to retrieve a DNA-laden object like a paper cup or a cigarette?
Okay. It's not out of the realm of possibility. It is possible. If let's say they did have a suspect and this suspect decided I'm not leaving the house and he stays in the house for since November 13th until now, then yes, that's possible because then they don't have any way of getting DNA or anything from him. However, if he's going about his normal day-to-day, he or she, then there will be multiple opportunities to collect DNA. You'd be surprised. I've followed people around just to wait for them to blow their nose and take the tissue, or spit on the ground. Unfortunately, these are things we do, but and it's completely legal, by the way. But if they have a suspect and he's out and about, he or she or they will be able to collect DNA. But it is still possible, yes.
And that is the non-glamorous side of police work, but that is old-fashioned shoe polish detective work. On to the next comment. I would love, and this has come up before, Steve, you might be able to help clarify this. I would love to hear you ask one of the investigative professionals or media experts that you have on what they think of this case possibly being connected with two other open cases, one in Oregon and the other in Washington State. In Oregon, there was a young couple attacked at around 3 a.m. while they slept. The man was stabbed to death. It goes on. The other case was in Washington State, and a middle-aged woman was killed in the same fashion while she slept in the early morning hours. This happened, I believe, in 2020. Steve, I believe police have already come out and says that there is no connection. You probably know about those cases better. What have you heard?
I've heard the same thing. Police have said repeatedly that as brutal as those crimes were, and some similarities, they're not related. The cases are simply not connected. Now, in the long run, will that prove to be not the case? I suppose it's possible. But at this time, I think that again falls into the realm of pretty outrageous speculation, barring some statement or fact that comes out later.
For Professor Titus from Elizabeth Healy, great show always. It just got better with Professor Titus and Professor Smith. I'm obsessed with this one thing, and it does not get discussed much. What's often talked about is how the murderer got in, but how the heck did he leave? I'd like to hear different theories on that. He had to get in a car in order to get away quickly. It's not like he could just walk down the dark street and call an Uber all covered in blood. Does she make a good point here? And how do how could he get away so easily?
Yes, absolutely. That is a great question. And I'm sure investigators tackled that with the same intensity that they tackled how the person got in. How did they get away? Where did they go? How did they get away? If they went somewhere where there were other people around, that means that someone saw them covered in blood. Someone saw them in this emotional, erratic state after. So which leads you to believe that someone knows something besides the actual suspect. So there are a lot of questions like that. But then again, there's a lot of what ifs. Like if the offender is familiar with the location, he knows how to get in and out without, he knows maybe to park his car in the back and go out the back window and go down, so there's all kind of different possibilities. But it sounds like the individual had some familiarity with the location, so he or she would know how to get in or out without.
Again, it's really important to keep in mind the geography here, the topography. It's a small college town. This was an off-campus housing unit in an area that is extremely dark at night. There's not a lot of street lighting. It's right up against a forested area, and it's just a very short walk or run to the Arboretum, which is a large forested area that's part of the campus. There are lots of ways for people to move about in the middle of the night and not necessarily have to jump in a car, and you're certainly not going to find Uber. It's a very small town, very small town.
Next comment comes from Gutfinski. One of the problems with this case from the beginning is that authorities assured the public that there was no danger and they had the situation under control. Because of that, citizens who had fresh and pertinent information figured that the police had whatever they needed. Now, over a month later, some who could have provided crucial information in the beginning are starting to come forward. Unfortunately, at this point, videotapes have been overwritten, witnesses have left the area, and other evidence may no longer be available. We always hear about this, Professor Titus, in terms of targeting, not targeting, scaring the community, not scaring the community. But what about from an investigative standpoint? Did law enforcement shoot themselves in the foot, so to speak, by saying things were okay early on and maybe missing tips from people in the area?
Well, just as it is law enforcement's responsibility to keep everyone safe, it's also their responsibility to make everyone feel safe. So finding the right balance is what is necessary. Saying too much, which is what I feel is one of the major issues with this case. Saying too much could possibly do exactly as that caller stated, make people believe that they have enough information. It's a very fine line between comfort and fear when it comes to these type of cases. So it's difficult. I wouldn't put the blame on the police department. They did what they thought was the best for the community, which is a very distinctive community. College. It's not your regular community. It's a college town, so it's different. There are students there and parents miles and hundreds of miles away, and there's all kind of different parts of the equation that make it very difficult.
A few more comments and we'll call it a wrap. This one comes from Social Butterfly. I believe this monster was injured. Someone out there knows if someone has a hand wound. How dare you cover for this thing? Not a person, but a thing. You need to report this immediately. Back to you, Professor Titus. I mean, this kind of just horrific quadruple homicide with essentially a butcher knife. What is the likelihood that the suspect or suspects did get hurt committing this crime?
It's very likely. That type of homicide, for individuals repeatedly stabbing, if it's just one person, absolutely. Not only were they covered in blood, they more than likely got injured on their hands. There has to be someone, I believe, someone knows this person. Someone, it could be a mother, it could be, it could be a parent, it could be a sibling. Someone had to have seen this individual come back, or someone has seen someone who has these injuries, and either they're not putting the two together, or they are, and they just don't want to, turn the person in. I think that's a possibility, very much so.
Next comment, and Professor Smith, this is a little more up your alley. It's too bad right after word got out on the murders, they didn't put it on the local TV and radio news to tell all people and businesses to check and recheck any video footage and educate them too that they could lose it if they wait too long, depending on their type of cameras. They're obviously referring to some surveillance video that expired after X amount of days. So Professor Smith, Steve, what is the role of the media in making sure the public is informed in a situation like this to do whatever is necessary to help solve a crime, if anything?
Well, this goes back to what I've said before. I think in the first 3-4 days of this case, local media was not maybe as aggressive as they could be. Just as quadruple homicide is going to completely overwhelm the resources of the local police department. Remember, it took 3 days, 4 days to bring in the Idaho State Patrol and then the FBI. It also is going to overwhelm local media. And I'm not sure that the right questions were asked at the beginning. They were certainly raised within a matter of days. Was it swift enough to preserve some of the evidence that students in particular might have had on their cell phones? Other kinds of surveillance equipment. I can't speak to that. I don't know.
Next comment from Lynn Purcell. I came into this late. My question would be, if the house was a party house, Professor Titus, and many weekends there were people going in and out, how difficult would it be to find suspect DNA, and wouldn't a defense attorney argue that point? How much more complicated does it become that so many people were allegedly in and out of this house, Professor Titus?
Yes, well, that definitely becomes a tool for the defense if if and when we get to that point. Because like you said, there's a lot of people coming in and out. However, the DNA is there, so it's still evidence. It still could lead investigators to the right individual. It's just a lot of sorting through, almost like the tips. It's a lot of information, but there could be something good there, and you have to look at each piece of each DNA sample, each piece, each tip as the possible key to the case, and you have to just aggressively investigate it. So, but yes, absolutely, it could definitely be a good argument for the defense when the time comes.
And a final comment, we'll get final thoughts and we'll get out of here. This one is from Town Trekker back to Professor Titus. This came up. I interviewed, by all accounts, a legendary Houston detective. I believe he has 400 homicide cases. He had a show called The Interrogator because that was his skill set, was interrogating people. And he brought up something about satellite surveillance. So this commenter, after seeing that episode, writes, I'm glad to hear someone mention satellite surveillance. There's no doubt one of the eyes in the sky could have picked up something. I think they'd also be checking not only local sellers of hunting knives, but also online sellers who shipped hunting knives to Idaho within the last 6 months or so. Satellite imagery might be tough in a place like New York City, but could it be a helpful tool in Moscow, Idaho, Professor?
Yes, it could be used, and if it is something that is feasible, the FBI is definitely on it. Trust me. We've had cases where we've had people found in the rivers that surround New York City, and we weren't sure if the body came from New Jersey or someone came from one of the bridges. And we've had so many resources, federal resources, where we call the Navy and get the flow of the current and the rate and the this and the that, and we're able to figure out so many different things. I am sure that the FBI has, if that's a feasible situation, as Professor Smith said, it's very dark out, so I'm not sure how well satellite will be able to pick up an image in, like, let's say, complete blackness. But if it's feasible, I'm sure it's being done. Absolutely.
And Professor Titus, when you're working a homicide, particularly a triple homicide that you said you worked, how many hours a night are you sleeping and how many hours a day are you thinking about it? And what kind of toll does that take on you?
Yeah, it takes a huge toll. In the beginning, in the first 3 to 4 days, you're not sleeping much. You're getting uh the first night probably no sleep. The second night maybe 3 or 4 hours, and it may increase an hour per night from there up until maybe about 4 or 5 tops. But it is constantly on your mind. A lot of times, as an investigator, especially when you've spoken to the family and the friends, and you begin to feel their pain, and the case becomes personal, not personal to the point where you're making mistakes, but personal to the point where you feel vested, you have a vested interest in catching this individual. And sometimes you don't even realize that you haven't eaten, that you haven't slept, because you're just so into the investigation. It becomes part of you. You breathe, and it's just in you. It becomes very intense. It can. We've had cases where you know we've had detectives in my office say, I can't wait to catch this guy. I'm going to put the handcuffs on him and say, such and such and such, you're under arrest for the murder of, just like TV, because they're just so, like, you're just so into the case. So that's usually what happens, and you can get lost in it. And you have to, like, once the case is over, or you break it up into shifts, and you have to unwind. You have to have some kind of outlet, whether it's working out, maybe you go home to your family, because you can get lost in it.
And I bring that up because they do incredible work. It's hard work. It's a lot of times it's thankless work. So we appreciate it. Let's get some final thoughts from each of you. Professor Stephen Smith, please tell everyone your blog and where do you think we head from here?
Yeah, I don't have a blog, but I do write a weekly column for a local digital news site. I just think it's really important to remind people from outside our region, the kind of communities we're talking about, the twin communities of Moscow and Pullman, the home of Washington State University. This is not like urban America. These are very small towns that are completely dominated by the universities that exist there. The student populations are larger than the native populations. And the concept of a party house, for example, simply doesn't apply. They're all party houses. Students come, they go, they move from place to place. They have parties on the weekends, particularly in a place like Moscow where there's not much else to do. The life is completely different than we might think of daily life in a non-college town environment. And I'm sure that presents unique challenges to investigators. It increases the transient suspect pool substantially, tracking people down to talk to and to interview, particularly when they've left town for the holidays. But it's important to remember that. It's important to remember the geography of these communities. They're in wooded, hilly places. There's not a lot of light when you get outside the main community. They're very dark. And the last point I would make is these are hunting communities. These are places where people hunt and fish pretty much universally. So when you're looking for a K-bar style military knife, it's not just online deliveries to Moscow or sales from local hardware stores. You're talking about students from all over the world, faculty and staff from all over the country and the world who might be coming to Moscow with things that they've owned for a long time from a lot of different places. This all falls into the myth. I'm sure, as Professor Titus could attest, that these cases can be solved as efficiently as a 1-hour episode of CSI.
The only hunting and fishing I do is for restaurants in Miami. Dr. Titus, 500 homicide cases investigated. You got a master's, you got a PhD, you got a sweet looking vest on. I can tell you don't mess around. Where do you think we go from here? And do people need to relax with law enforcement and give them a little bit more time? You get the final word.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. This case will be solved. Law enforcement has suspects, or they have answers. They have evidence. They have answers. We must give them time. And you'll see that they will come up with a suspect that will be brought in out of the blue, and it'll be breaking news. And the case everything will just come together, and then all of the answers will be put out there for everyone. But just have patience. And the family, it's very difficult to put yourself in the position of the family, but they have to be very careful that they don't hinder the investigation by making statements and going on social media and doing things like that. They have to maintain faith in their local law enforcement and the FBI, because it takes time. It takes time.
It takes time, everyone. We've got the best guests in the entire media landscape. I do not hesitate to say that because I'm not a guest. I'm just a host. Just had Dr. Alfred Titus, Professor Steve Smith, Professor Titus. Thank you so much. Don't worry, we'll be back with another episode of Surviving the Survivor. Love you, America.